Okay, I'm going to move the direction from a history lesson of talking. Let's talk about Kenpo, how it was created, some of the concepts and principles it developed. Let's get some history, because a lot of people have asked me to ask questions of our guests, and some of them, they give me their opinion or answer, and so maybe it's time for us to talk about that. One of the things that you always talked to me about was the 8 considerations. Why don't you talk about that and how Mr. Parker shared that with you?
Well, Mr. Parker being an extremely organized person, and once the business end of Kenpo started, we needed something to sell. And the Tracys were big on that. Tom Connor was a dance instructor at Arthur Murray, and much like our teaching methods back in the late 60s, early 70s were fashioned after the Arthur Murray studios. You go in and sign up for 2 or 3 different types of dance, ballroom and cha-cha or whatever. So you go get a private lesson that week, and at the end of the week you go to a dance. And that kind of remotely will sound familiar to a private lesson in karate. And then you go to group class. And that's kind of where that came from. And so they would sign you up on a contract for 6 months or a year. And then you do your dances, you do your belts, and then you move on and go to the next level. So the evolution of Kenpo is quite varied. And as the evolution of the business flipped in, not only did the business flip in, but also the development of the art flipped in. Mr. Parker always gave Professor Chow the kudos that he gave him the keys. What Chow did and what we do is pretty much, I mean, Bruce Lee said it, a punch is a punch, and there's not much difference in that. How you do it, how you deliver it, what your philosophy is different. So it's not, it's really pretty much the same type of thing, but he organized it in terms of ways that people that didn't know anything about anything now could start learning, which is where the techniques started coming from, the web of knowledge, which are all the different categories of techniques. And then, of course, all that's bound by numerous different concepts and principles, one being the 8 considerations, which are 8 different considerations that you need to know about in terms of being successful, which are acceptance, accepting the fact that you can and will be possibly attacked in our lifetime, environment, range, positions, maneuvers, targets, natural weapons on your body, and natural defenses that we have. Those are the 8 considerations. And as we go through techniques, everything there fits into these categories. So as you explain things out, you're going to find out, well, why are you doing that move? Well, because that natural weapon is going to go to that target that you have available. And these are all 8 considerations. So to me, the 8 considerations are very important. Just like the 3 points of view, if you go to book 1, page 1 of the Infinite Insights, you'll find 3 points of view. He started with that because he wanted you to study from 3 different angles. And his whole premise to the system was based on logic. And so he felt that either something is useful, unuseful, or useless. And so as he developed more and more and more, his mind was like a sieve. The more he got into it, the more he learned. And a lot of people around him too that he came in contact with. Skip, for example, came in, and one of his fortes was always on concepts. What are the principles and concepts? And so he gave Skip this more or less project to go through and tell me all the principles are involved in each technique. And Skip really brought a huge amount of knowledge to that table by his study of that. I was more into fighting and teaching and things like that. So teaching is a huge thing with me. Being a physical education teacher, I see that I didn't know that I was going to be teaching Kenpo. I thought I was going to be coaching football or basketball. But it turned out to be extremely beneficial to me by taking that path.
Okay. You want to talk about, I know that you've dealt with some general principles. Do you have any understanding of how the forms were created, who created the forms, and how they were developed?
I don't know from a super technical standpoint. I never was really interested in actually who did it. I believe Jimmy Wing Woo had a great, I think, somewhat of an influence into that. And I know Mr. Parker was one of those roustabouts where he went everywhere. He went to Chinatown, and he was greatly respected by numerous different communities. Shotokan people, Taekwondo people, Kung Fu people. You know, he was good friends with Masatatsu Oyama, the one that actually chopped the horn off the bull, is what he was famous for. Which, by the way, you know why he did that? He did that because someone said, no. His family was starving, and they said, if you can go out there and kill that bull, have the meat. So he said, okay, and the rest became legend. And of course, he's known, Kyokushinkai is just an incredibly brutal system, you know. So every system's got its flash. Emperado was Ed Parker's senior. Ed Parker told me, well, the only senior I really look up to is Emperado, and so he had a great respect for Adriano Emperado, rest his soul, you know, as well, you know. So Mr. Parker just loved creating. He loved organizing. When he found something better, he adjusted it, and adjust is a big word.
You're talking about techniques, and we were talking with Chuck Sullivan, and he basically said Mr. Parker was the one that created those forms in the beginning. I'm guessing after Wu left, it would be obvious that a lot of these forms were developed and techniques were developed. Were you involved with any of that?
Not with those forms. Those were done way before I even started. So I was more involved. I was really into weapons at one point. And by this time, I was a 5th degree black belt in '85, and I went to him and I said, "Look, when are you gonna create some forms with weapons? We got a staff set that Chuck Sullivan kind of started, but what about some swords and tiger forks and kwandos and different sabers, and you know, of course, he obviously had knives and guns that he was, you know, fond of." And he said, and I said, "When are you going to create some saber forms?" He goes, "When are you going to do it?" And I went, "Whoa, I'm not sure I'm qualified to do that." And so then we had a lesson on what do you look for in a particular weapon. You look at the weapon and you evaluate it. That was his thing. Is you take a sword, for example, any particular sword, and you look at that exact sword. What are the benefits of the sword? What are the detriments of the sword? How could you use this sword? When would you use it? Why would you use it? How would you use it? And that was his thought process with dealing with things. The staff, you got a long range use. You put your hands in thirds, and you got double ended. You know, so he had his mind was a continual generator of ideas and of thoughts and of comparisons.
I see. Were you involved with any of the extensions?
No, you know, the extensions when I first learned, you know, 32 techniques and stuff, a lot of that stuff was all together. When I learned, for example, Dance of Death, it was all together at one point. It wasn't split up into 2 sections like it is today. So I learned the whole thing.
Same here. So that's exactly when I came up. That was exactly what we had: 10 yellow and 32 techniques per belt, from orange all the way to green. But then later on, there was a restructuring of the system from 32. Why don't you talk about that?
Well, right when I came in, it was right at the tail end of 32, and it was going right into the 24 technique. In fact, Tom Kelly told me it was 25. So I reprinted all these charts and everything to try to be ahead of the curve. Then Mr. Parker comes out with a 24. So I call Mr. Kelly up and I go, "What did you tell me 25 for?" So I'm not listening to you anymore. You know, you've just made me spend a whole bunch of money on printing here. You know, so you go, "Don't listen to me then. I'm not going to tell you nothing." I'm going, "Well, I'm just kidding. I'm just kidding." You know.
How much contribution did Mr. Kelly have and say Huck Planis?
Well, Huck Planis was a student at Tom Kelly's. They both studied. They started in Steve Labonte's school. I believe it was in Fresno, California. Same with Ralph Castellanos and Benny Castellanos. Those guys came in, and so Kelly, Huck was a student of Kelly's, I believe, up through green or brown maybe. Then after that, Mr. Parker took him on. Mr. Parker moved Kelly from Pasadena to El Paso, and Huck went with him down to El Paso for a while down there. And then Mr. Parker decided to move him from El Paso to Salt Lake. And Mr. Kelly goes, "What about Huck?" And he goes, "I really don't need Huck. I just need you up there." And he goes, "Well, Huck wants to go." And Mr. Parker said, "Wait, if he wants to go, let him go. I'm not paying him though. So if he wants to go, let him go." And so he came up there and helped Kelly for a while. And then, of course, Mr. Parker eventually saw the value. Kelly and Huck did the original manuals that they put together, which were very, very vague, but they weren't meant to be taught out of. They were meant just to be reminders of the techniques you learned in a class. But now today, the manuals, and Skip was a great contributor to helping organize the depth of the manuals today. So he did a great job of really helping Mr. Parker organize. Skip would spend, as I recall, he was like down at Pasadena for 4 or 5 weeks at one point. Steady, he just came down there and spent a lot of time helping Mr. Parker. It's right toward, it was in 1990, I believe, and he was really working hard. And of course, unfortunately, he passed away. And we got two volumes out of like 40 volumes in the videos, and we just never got the rest of them done.
Let me ask you this. Let's talk about the techniques. Obviously, the original 32 that you referenced to, I know about that. Then it went down to 24, and subsequently went down to smaller numbers, 16 and 12, et cetera, et cetera. Some schools are even less than that. Did Parker have a preference on that? Did he? I mean, obviously it was the same material, just restructured, correct?
You're going to get some people that want to argue about this, but the original 32 were the ones he restructured, early on, and then because of business and such, he needed more, breakout to sell. The 32 ended at green. It was orange, purple, blue, and green, and then there was nothing in browns other than maybe a couple of forms. And so when he went to the 24 techniques, he was able to push that up, that plus great extensions all the way up to third black. But the thing is, when you start breaking 32 down and you put 24, you start laying the techniques out, he fell short on some of the 24 technique system up in the first brown. And so those techniques, a lot of people don't know where those came from. Where they came from were the forms. There was, I think, one from the short 3, and then there was the 4, 5, and 6, where the rest of those fill-ins. If you notice the upper brown, they're all guns, knives, and mostly guns and knives. There's only like 4 knife techniques.
Let me say this much
on
the forms. I remember up to 6, 7, and on going on were in the development. Do you know if any of those were ever finalized?
The 7 that I knew of was taught. He was teaching to Larry Tatum, and he told Larry not to teach it to anybody. And next thing you know, at the internationals, Ernie George goes out there and does this elaborate knife form, which was basically the 7 at that time.
Right.
And it was flashy. I mean, it looked good, and Ernie looked good doing it. It kind of irritated Mr. Parker, though. I think Tatum got an earful because he told him not to teach anybody yet because he wasn't done with it. And so it kind of irritated him. But I think that irritated Mr. Parker was everybody started going up to him, "Hey, where'd that come from? When are we going to learn that? What is that? What form is that?" And so he got deluged with questions, about it. And Ernie had smoke machines and lighting and stuff. It looked really good. It looked pretty impressive. But the 7 was the knife set. And then when Speakman came along in 88, 89, 90 there, doing the perfect weapon, we were all doing stick stuff. Mr. Parker brought out, I met Remy Priestis at one of the internationals, and we sat and chatted for pretty much the whole final, so I found him very interesting. And we were doing a lot of club stuff, and so all of a sudden the clubs came out, and the clubs became a part of our curriculum. So we had the club sets, and of course he did have a nunchuck set, which is all the way up at first black, but it really could easily be taught a yellow belt. I mean, it's that simple. but he didn't want anybody doing weapons till they got into black belt. He wanted the empty hand material mastered first, or at least quasi-mastered, as we should say.
So you telling me that just before he died, though, nothing was solidified then?
I don't think so. They were still working on. He was working on the club set, and he moved the 7, which was a knife set. He moved that to 8, and he put the clubs in at 7.
I see. The book, though, that you wrote the foreword for, was that ever? I think there was something on Facebook by Dr. Chappelle, and he had basically did an outline of what was going to take place with the book. But did you ever get a chance to look at the manuscript? Or
of course, yeah, of course.
Oh, well, good. Inquiring Kenpo minds would like to know. Tell us about it.
Kenpo in the streets. I mean, he had talked about Kenpo. I mean, talking about realistic street combat, which is what Ed Parker was all about. He wasn't about tournament play. He was more. He did it because it was a moneymaker, and it brought people together from all different systems, so they could test their skills against one another. And so there was purpose for everything. But the thing with Kenpo in the streets was learning how to. I remember a couple of things off the top of my head. He took his shoes off and he put his hand in the shoe if he's up against a knife attack. So you've got something to protect your hands. You got these shoes on your hands to protect that. He took his belt off that would hold his pants up.
Was that technique? What was it? What was the name of that technique? Foot and mouth? What?
Yeah, foot and mouth. That was it's going to be
that one. That's for Alfred. Sorry, I just knew he was watching, and Dr. Cotton is ready to jump in on that one. I knew.
Alfred, we're going to call it foot and something else in a minute here.
Yeah.
foot up something.
So, yeah, exactly. Well, if you've ever been in front of him, he'd probably be in the back end as you're running away very fast.
Well, he would talk about pencils and pens and implements that you would have right at your hand, right in your environment. There we go to the 8 considerations now. Environment, anything in, on, or around you. And ashtrays makes nice projectiles. Plates makes nice projectiles. He took a plate once and was talking to me and he broke it. And he said, if you throw this, what's going to happen? Well, wow. I never thought about breaking the plate, because now you got a rough edge, a glass edge, that you would actually cut, much like a throwing star.
I referenced to kill the golden goose.
Yes.
Remember he used that scene? For those who didn't watch the movie, you'll know what I'm talking about.
What? Sticking a fork in a guy's hand and taking a piano wire and hook it up to drive shaft. I mean, ingenious, a variety of things. So he was using Kenpo in the streets, how to use logic of what's around you and available to you. A lot of people in the old Western movies would take a shirt or a coat off and wrap it around their forearm if they were in a knife fight. So he took it a step further and went into a lot more. It took his belt off. We used a karate belt, but you could easily use your pants belt and use that as a weapon to, actually block and snap people in the face, and use that as a whip like towels in the locker room. So there were numerous things, and that was what Kenpo was in the streets was all about, was using things based on Kenpo theory and logic and applying them to street warfare.
Do you think that book will ever be published?
I hope so. I think it could be very easily. That's up to Edmund Jr. whether he wants to do that or not. I hope he does. I think he's totally scrapped the speak with a knife. Speak with a club, I think, would also be a good one to be published.
I see.
So I think it's a good book to open people's minds to innovation, just like Ed Parker was all about. That was his middle name. I know it's Kealoha, but it was Edmund Kealoha Innovation Parker.
Kealoha, yeah. You know what? While we're here, there's a couple shout outs. Ruben, it's good to see you there. You could, at least you should brush the hair a little more, pal. Last time I saw you, yeah, it was all nice and short. Patrick, are you awake, or are we interrupting you? Yeah, he's like, there's a smile. Good. There's a few people. There's a lot. There's Wes. I see Zach, Frank, There's a bunch of iPhones, but I don't know. I see Skip is here. Skip, if
Hi,
you get a
Skip.
chance, we'd love to have you, jump in there and say something if you have a moment. It'd be nice. We'll open. And there's Derek. Derek, you know what? Yesterday we were talking, and I asked a question to your brother Wes about your father, and we're talking about weapons. So I'm going to interrupt you for just a second, Mr. Conatser, and let Derek speak about his father's story at the internationals. And you're now unmuted. So you're up, Derek. Tell us about your father and his knife and his black belt thesis.
Well, for those of you that may or may not know or may even have been there, my father got his black belt in '68, and he did his black belt thesis on double knife against knife. And make a long story short, he was there at the internationals. He got up, he did his thing. He did his thesis, and at the end of it all, he'd already had it pre-measured to where he had a board placed right in front of the judges and had somebody on standby to pop up a target, where after Dad finished his last big hoopla, did a judo roll, grabs a Parker knife, throws it, and sticks it in a target right like 5 feet in front of these traditional Japanese and Korean and Shotokan judges, and really, really, really pissed them off. And he's one of the main reasons why live weapons are not allowed in tournaments anymore. He also just happened to be the same time that he met Bruce Lee. And I think it's a pretty funny story that Mr. Parker called my father over to meet Bruce Lee after all this, and really, really hyped and talked up Dad to Mr. Parker, or Mr. Parker did to Bruce Lee, and was like, "This is Gil Hibben, world famous knife maker, yada, yada, yada," just saying all these amazing things about my father. And he looks at my dad and goes, "This is Bruce. He's pretty good."
You know, for those that don't know, will you please tell everybody just quickly some of the iconic knives your father has made, including the one I have.
Oh,
Look at that.
Paul,
buddy.
may I interrupt for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
Derek?
Oh,
Sure.
Skip is there.
Yeah. You guys, can you see what I have in my hand?
That is a Mark.
That's Mr. Parker's personal knife that your dad made for him.
That is an early version. There's actually 8 different versions of the Parker knife. And
No, this is the knife he actually made for him.
Wes, I muted you as well, so you can.
Correct. No, that's what I'm saying is what everybody knows as the Parker knife. The one that you're holding in your hand is a special one that he made as the Mark. It looks like a Mark 7, and that was more for the forward grip. And that's one that, like what my father used in his black belt thesis, that he presented to Mr. Parker at the internationals.
Yeah, it's meant for long held grip.
Yes.
Yeah, it's not meant for the short held grip.
Correct.
Right. So anyway, it's got the IKK patch on it, guys, and it's got Mr. Parker's name engraved on it. In the back, it's got the international flame. It's like way beyond cool, guys.
That's a treasure. That's a treasure, sir. Hold on to it.
Yeah, it was given to me by the Parker family after he died.
Is there any blood on it?
Not mine.
Not yet.
I'll tell you. You know the reason I say that, Skip. When I was over in Japan, Master Long gave me his personal one of his personal swords, and I brought it back, and I had a hell of a time bringing that back in, I think, 88, 89. They would not let me take it through customs, and I had to call him, and literally, because he was knighted by the Queen, he made the call, and they said, "Okay, you can take it back, but it has to go in the cockpit." Yeah. I said, what good is that? But Master Long told me they never drew their sword or knife unless they intended to draw blood.
Yeah. So I didn't mean to interrupt too much there, Derek, but I just thought it'd be cool as what you were talking about at this moment.
Let me break in real quick to talk to Skip.
Okay.
Skip said it wasn't his blood. However, he was at my school once.
Oh God, no.
And he was doing a demo, and I had just had some brand new mats on the floor. And he's out there doing his thing, and all of a sudden, bam, he jams himself into I believe it was his right hip. not his hip, his right quad. And he throws the knife on the floor, and it sticks in the floor, and it makes a rip in the floor. And I tell everybody that's watching, I go, everybody, you see this? This is exactly why I don't let you use live knives on my brand new floor. Skip's sitting there bleeding, and he's got his hand on his quad. And all my students remember is how I yelled at him for splitting my mat. Of course, then we took him to the hospital, and there was a deep gash. You had to have like 2 or 3 layers from the bottom up of stitches coming out of that little gash. It's only about an inch and a half long, but it went deep.
Yeah, it was right next to one that I'd got in El Salvador.
You know, while we got Skip on the line, Skip, when you went to England with Dennis, what did he say to put you to sleep?
I never slept.
Oh, it was a possum move, huh? Okay.
I never slept.
Well, we've got you on here between the two of you. This is really great. Can you add anything that you want to say about Mr. Parker that Dennis has not covered?
Oh, wow.
No, I don't want to take all that time. Maybe some other time I would talk, because this is Dennis's time.
Well, I know that he would be there to say that. Just any passing thoughts, just something simple.
Beautiful. Thank you.
He was.
Tell him, Skip, how we would harass Mr. Parker with, oh, wow.
Okay, I'll give you, we harass him once in a while because we could do it once in a while. So one time he came to my tournament, and he came off the plane in Spokane. You know how when you get off a plane and people have signs, like there's a limo driver, they have a sign for whoever. Well, we made a sign, Dennis and I made a sign for Ed Parker. And all these people were coming down the ramp, and we stick the sign in their face, like, are you Ed Parker? Are you Ed Parker? And when he saw us, he just walked right by us and kept on going right down the ramp.
Oh, my. Well, thank you very much for sharing that with us, Skip.
All right.
And I really appreciate you here to be to support Dennis. Wait, while we got you, we will ask you this. Who created Form 4?
Well, I would say Ed Parker did. And it was also his favorite form. Okay. He simply said it. If you ever watched him move, he would get into it. He would get into moving.
He dug that form. There
was 45 things that Form 4 taught, and the theme was therapeutic rhythm, right? The ability to make your muscles move through space, and while they were moving, one muscle group is gaining energy while the other one's doing its thing, and so you never burn out. So if you think about all the times people talk about Form 4 and you watch them in the tournaments, they talk about hitting the wall, right? So you'd hit a certain point where people they're looking good and then they burn out. And that's what that form was supposed to teach, and no one could do it like him. And that is his explosion. And you can do every move in the form without ever stopping, right? You can actually flow from one move to the next. Most people have never seen it that way. And I might do it for the Garage Monkeys next week. They're doing short form 4, so I might do it that way. So they can
When did short form 4 come about? Who developed that?
That was just an idea, talking around with things with Mr. Parker. So I'll do short form this week. Huh? Yes.
Did he actually approve that form?
Sure. And you can do Form 5, short 6, short 7. Right? Yeah, because the principle is pretty simple to do. And actually, when my own students do tournaments and forms, unless it's a Kenpo tournament, they don't do a form like Form 4. You would do a short 4 because the form's a little too long. And actually, when you do your right side, left side, you actually competed against yourself. So they can see how well you do the one side, so you cut your own throat when you do that aside. Sure. So doing the other form where it flows better. So it's a pretty good competitive form to do it that way.
I remember going to the internationals in the black belt division and seeing, I can't tell how many people doing form. Yeah. And it was
and hit the wall, right?
Oh my God! It was.
If you're judging them, as I did, oftentimes you're waiting for them to hit the wall. They hit lactic acid, and their muscles burn out.
Yeah, exactly. Well, unless your name was Frank Trejo.
Unless your name was Frank Trejo.
Then you were Frank Trejo. That was
there was a couple of guys that could do it, but not many.
Yeah, and I never seen, but I could never. I mean, he taught me that form, how to dress it up, but I could never do it as fast as him, ever.
Yeah, but he had that same idea, that main theme of what Mr. Parker was talking about, the therapeutic rhythm. So he knew how to pause at the right moment, long 3, you're learning about harnessing the force. So he knew how to harness his energy, so he didn't expend it. That's why Frank was so good at that form.
Is there anything that you felt that Mr. Parker, that was unfinished in his life before he passed away, that sadly we will never know about?
A lot of stuff. A lot of stuff. Yeah. So the Form 8 was not finished. That was a new form, was not finished. His vision of the Encyclopedia of Kenpo was actually a 24-volume set of books on the Encyclopedia of Kenpo. So what people published was actually the Dictionary of Kenpo. It was just his notes.
Those are just some notes, right?
So. And
Wasn't
then
that just
the whole gigantic video series? The whole was huge. Right? It was like there was a video for every form, all the techniques, the freestyles. I wrote all these scripts for them. We never got to do. So, yeah. So I'm going to back out of that because.
You think that'll ever be completed, or no?
What's that?
Any of that material?
I guess
probably not.
Right. No. Yeah. So.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you, Skip.
Right.
You know, I really appreciate you throwing in on there and supporting Dennis. He always speaks so highly of you.
Well, I'll mute myself so that Dennis can take back over again. Right?
Well, we'll just put you on mute. If we want you, just raise your hand.
I can mute myself. Okay.
All right. There we go. So anyway, so that was a nice little, participation by Skip Hancock. I mean, geez, you couldn't get any better to talk to two people that would really know what was going on in the last, I hate to say the last days of Ed Parker, but it's, I think if we talk later to Carl Totten, and he'll say that knowledge, the worst thing is that fail to reach out and to talk to seniors that would be there to learn something. Because as I've said to Dennis, and I've said this to all the Hall of Famers that have been inducted over the years, they are rare books, not vintage books or classic books or old books. They are rare books because they bring to the table knowledge, personal knowledge, and experiences that can never be replicated. I mean, you can draft a book and you can talk about your personal life. It's not the same as actually speaking and spending quality time. So Dennis, let's continue on. So you were talking about one of the theories of Mr. Parker out of Infinite Insights, and that was the 8 considerations. So you talked about environment. Why don't you go through the rest while we have a few minutes before I open up the questions for the people to ask you?
Well, the 8 considerations themselves were acceptance, environment, range, positions, maneuvers, targets, natural weapons, and natural defenses. And those are kind of a fundamental basics outline of considerations, when you're performing, either for tournaments or whatever, but more importantly on the street. It's important to take in consideration many factors: environment, anything in, on, or around you; range, out of range, in range; contact penetration, contact manipulation. Each one of those he broke down into. In fact, those 4 ranges, Skip, I, and Lee, on our way to England that time, I believe Skip, I believe it was Skip that brought a magazine in, that there was a guy that was in Karate Illustrated or Black Belt, one or the other, that said that Kenpo is the least effective in close. And boy, did we tear that to pieces. And that's out of that trip came the dimensional stages of action: out of range, in range, contact penetration, and contact manipulation, which is, extremely close. And so, he continually took what he had and developed it more and more and more. Let's see what I say: out of range, in range, it's acceptance, environment, range, positions, all different positions, stances, positions, standing, sitting, laying down, maneuvers, all kinds of maneuvers, foot maneuvers, body maneuvers, which are very rarely covered, dives, vaults, rolls, a plethora of maneuvers. If you look at book, I believe the maneuvers are covered in book 3, I believe 3 or 4, one of those. It's got those maneuvers in there. And, so there's a lot of stuff that basically is unchecked. We don't talk much about Lua. He said that's one of the things he's going to take with him to the grave, with some of his training in Lua. But we spend a lot of time with natural weapons, our blocks, our punches, our kicks, our knees, and of course natural defenses.